Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're looking at this totally fascinating collision of cutting-edge biology, national survival, and frankly, massive public budgets. Look, right now Singapore is facing an unprecedented demographic crisis. We're talking about a rapidly aging population and a shrinking workforce. And in response, well, the government has allocated a staggering $37 billion research budget. To put that into perspective, that's thousands of dollars from every single citizen in the country. And with that kind of money on the table, there's this massive, almost gravitational temptation to fund a sci-fi medical solution to solve a very human problem. We're talking about a technology called in vitro gametogenesis, or IVG. But we really have to ask, is this highly speculative science actually the right place for taxpayer money? Let's find out.
Okay, let's just dive right in. Here's our roadmap for today. 1. Singapore's demographic crisis. 2. The illusion of IVG. 3. Scientific and safety barriers. 4. The opportunity cost. 5. The legal deal breaker. And 6. A smarter strategy.
All right, starting with part 1, Singapore's demographic crisis.
0.87. Let that sink in for a second. That is a truly staggering number. That's Singapore's historic low total fertility rate projected for 2025, which, by the way, is a significant drop from 0.97 just the year prior in 2024. For a population to just replace itself naturally, that number needs to be 2.1. So falling this far below the replacement level, it's not just some abstract sociological concern. It literally threatens national survival. You see, as a nation with basically no natural resources, Singapore relies entirely on its human capital. Without people, the economic engine just stalls out, the tax base shrinks, and maintaining things like defense capabilities becomes incredibly difficult.
And that brings us right back to the money. The government has committed a record $37 billion over 5 years under the Research, Innovation, and Enterprise 2030 Master Plan, also known as RIE 2030. A massive chunk of this is earmarked for the health and biomedical sciences domain. Now, with an ecosystem this well-funded, there is just an immense temptation to channel public resources into cutting-edge, experimental fertility tech. And why wouldn't there be? Because it feels like a magic bullet. It's incredibly tempting to try and engineer a high-tech way out of this demographic plunge, rather than facing the much harder societal changes that are actually required to fix it.
Moving on to part 2, the illusion of IVG.
So, what exactly is this proposed miracle technology? It's in vitro gametogenesis, or IVG. Put simply, it's the laboratory process of manipulating pluripotent stem cells, which, crazy enough, can be derived from ordinary adult somatic cells, like a simple skin biopsy, and coaxing them to differentiate into mature sperm and eggs. The foundational proof of concept for this has actually already been established by researchers in Japan. And yes, no joke, they actually created live, running-around mice entirely from skin cells using this method. Theoretically, it promises to treat absolute infertility, allowing people with a complete absence of viable gametes to have genetically related children.
Let's walk through how this builds out. The process looks elegantly simple. Step 1, you extract somatic cells, like a quick swab of skin cells. Step 2, you reprogram them into stem cells and induce meiosis. Meiosis is that highly specialized complex cell division that purposefully halves the chromosome numbers so a sperm and egg can eventually combine. Step 3, you develop them into mature, functional gametes in a lab dish. It sounds like this miraculous, futuristic assembly line for human life, ready to pump up those demographic numbers, right? Well, hang on a second.
If we actually look at the data, we can systematically debunk this whole demographic mirage. Just look at the real-world contribution of assisted reproductive technology, or ART, to total births in developed nations. In Australia and New Zealand, it's about 5%. In Japan, which has the highest percentage of IVF babies globally, it's just 5 to 8%. Even in Denmark, with literally the most robust public funding in the world for fertility treatments, it rarely exceeds 10%. The reality? Medical tech barely moves the needle. A 2 to 5% biological boost is not going to fix Singapore's 0.87 fertility rate, because the crisis is fundamentally socioeconomic. If a couple is terrified of the intense PSLE education pressure cooker, or they're trying to figure out how to afford a slightly larger HDB flat, unlocking biological fertility in a lab doesn't magically change their bank account or their daily stress levels.
All right, part 3, scientific and safety barriers. So we know it won't fix the population crisis. But what about the science itself? You see, translating reproductive biology from mice to humans is notoriously fraught with failure. In mouse models, gametogenesis takes a matter of weeks and requires relatively simple biological scaffolding. But human application? It is infinitely more complex.
In human females, oogenesis begins during fetal development and then arrests, literally pauses for decades before ovulation. To replicate this decades-long process in a lab dish, researchers would either need to harvest human fetal tissue to create a supportive niche for the cells to grow, which is an absolute ethical nightmare, or they would have to bioengineer incredibly complex artificial human ovaries and testes entirely from scratch.
So the crucial point here is the risk, the absolutely terrifying, unpredictable, transgenerational risks of artificially culturing human gametes. The entire life cycle of the gamete would happen in an artificial environment that simply cannot perfectly replicate the dynamic biochemical signaling of the human body. And this raises the alarming risk of accumulating genetic mutations and chromosomal segregation errors, known as aneuploidy. And honestly, even more concerning are the epigenetic risks. Errors in the delicate, invisible programming of DNA marks can lead to devastating developmental conditions, like Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome, Angelman syndrome, and Prader-Willi syndrome. These aren't minor issues. These are severe, lifelong conditions that deeply affect a child's physical growth and brain function.
The risks are so severe that the global scientific community is literally sounding the alarm. Listen to this authoritative quote from the Ethics Committee of the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. IVG should absolutely not be considered for reproductive purposes in humans until robust, long-term safety data is accumulated from non-human primate models across multiple generations. The International Society for Stem Cell Research also explicitly prohibits this for human reproductive purposes. We are talking about the necessity for decades of extensive safety testing on monkeys before any scientist should even think about human trials.
Which brings us to Section 4, the opportunity cost. Every funding decision carries a cost, right? And this brilliantly illustrates the stark contrast in how we allocate resources. On one side, we have speculative IVG research. It's a highly niche technology, decades away from any clinical use, and it would be so extraordinarily expensive that only the ultra-wealthy could ever hope to access it. On the exact opposite side, we have proven socioeconomic solutions. We're talking expanding universal childcare to help working parents, boosting HDP public housing grants to ease the massive financial burden on young couples, and investing in comprehensive elder care. Every single taxpayer dollar poured into speculative IVG is a dollar not spent on these tangible daily struggles. And furthermore, funding IVG diverts critical scientific talent away from research into age-related diseases, oncology, and preventative medicine, which are the areas that actually represent the overwhelming majority of Singapore's real disease burden.
And you know, there's also this profound ethical dilemma we really need to consider, because IVG can theoretically produce a virtually limitless supply of embryos from just a single skin biopsy. It totally opens the door to the commodification of human life. With hundreds of embryos available in a lab, prospective parents could utilize mass embryo screening, not just to prevent disease, but to actively select for desired traits. I mean, this borders on consumer-driven eugenics. So we have to ask, is it right to use public taxpayer money contributed by everyday citizens across all socioeconomic strata, to fund an elitist technology that could widen the social divide so drastically?
Now for Section 5, the legal deal breaker.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how local laws essentially block the most profitable commercial markets for IVG. You see, biomedical research is very often justified by its potential for commercialization, right? The goal is to create a profitable biotech industry. But Singapore has three massive legal hurdles standing in the way: a complete ban on surrogacy, the total exclusion of same-sex couples from accessing assisted reproductive technologies, and strict limits capping donor offspring to a maximum of 3 to 5 per donor.
So it makes absolutely zero business sense to invest public funds into a technology where your primary commercial avenues are locally illegal. Let's map the global market potential directly against Singapore law. A major market for IVG is women lacking a uterus who still desperately want genetic children, but they would require a surrogate to carry the pregnancy, which is completely banned in Singapore. Another highly anticipated application? Allowing same-sex couples to have genetically related children. That's a massive global market. Yet Singapore's family laws restrict ARTs strictly to legally married heterosexual couples. And finally, IVG could theoretically mass-produce donor eggs to solve global shortages, but Singapore law strictly caps donor offspring at 3 to 5 to prevent accidental consanguinity, which entirely negates the economic advantage of mass production.
Finally, Section 6, a smarter strategy.
So, if funding domestic IVG research is a demographic, scientific, and economic dead end for Singapore, what is the logical conclusion? The solution is what health economists call the wait and license strategy. Basically, let the bigger economies foot the massive bill for the early, highly risky research.
Developing complex, high-risk technologies like IVG requires immense capital and navigating an absolute minefield of clinical failures. Rather than shouldering those massive financial risks and ethical burdens domestically, Singapore should leverage the free rider advantage. Let larger economies like the US, the EU, and China absorb all those exorbitant sunk costs of R&D.
Here's how that timeline actually plays out. First, larger nations fund the R&D, conducting the decades, literally decades, of necessary primate and human trials. Second, the technology eventually achieves international regulatory approval, definitively proving its safety with trusted bodies like the FDA or EMA. And then finally, Singapore simply imports the mature, proven technology through the Health Sciences Authority or HSA licensing framework. Remember, Singapore built its early economic success precisely by being a highly efficient and rapid adopter of foreign technology. This strategy aligns perfectly with value-based healthcare, ensuring taxpayers only pay for treatments that deliver proven, tangible health gains.
Which brings us to a final, thought-provoking question. When we're dealing with billions in taxpayer dollars and a genuine national demographic crisis, we really have a choice to make. Should we fund speculative, decades-away science that addresses a tiny fraction of infertility, carries immense biological risks, and has zero legal commercial market locally? Or should we invest in the proven, tangible needs of our citizens today, like affordable housing, accessible childcare, and caring for an aging population? It's ultimately a question of prioritizing human welfare over medical science fiction. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.